Navy SEAL buried alive 72 hours dug through concrete with bare hands, 8 rats to survive. They held his funeral. While he crawled home, walked into his own wake. True Special Forces story, impossible survival against all odds. The concrete fell. The world went black. Nobody heard him scream. The explosion came without warning. 1 second, Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison was clearing a compound in Ramadi, Iraq. The next, the building collapsed on top of him. 3 floors of concrete, rebar, and dust crushing down in a roar that swallowed everything. Then silence. Complete. Total. Suffocating silence. Jake tried to move. Couldn't. His legs were pinned. His left arm trapped beneath something heavy. A beam, maybe. Concrete pressed against his chest, making every breath a fight. He thought desperately. He tried to yell. Nothing but echoes in a tomb of rubble. Above him, somewhere in the chaos, his team was fighting. He could hear muffled gunfire. Shouts. The thump of boots on debris. Jake screamed for his team, for Rodriguez, for Mitchell, but the concrete swallowed his voice. He cried out desperately, and slowly, terribly, the sounds above began to fade. His heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Not buried alive in a concrete tomb in the middle of hostile territory, he whispered fearfully. He'd survived Hell Week. He'd survived deployments to Afghanistan, Syria, and now Iraq. He'd been shot at, mortared, ambushed. But he'd never felt this kind of terror. The terror of being completely helpless, completely alone, completely forgotten. Before we continue this unbelievable survival story, hit that subscribe button, he said enthusiastically. What Jake Morrison went through in the next 72 hours will shock you. Comment below where you're watching from, and if you think you could survive what he survived. Because what you're about to hear is one of the most incredible survival stories in Navy SEAL history. He announced excitedly. 20 feet above Jake's tomb, Lieutenant Rodriguez tore through rubble with his bare hands. His fingers were bleeding. His knuckles were raw. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, he said intensely. The team had been searching for 6 hours since the building came down. The compound had been rigged with IEDs. Taliban fighters had detonated them remotely during the raid. Jake had been on the 2nd floor when it collapsed. 3 floors of reinforced concrete pancaking down in seconds. Nobody could have survived that kind of collapse. The weight alone would crush a human body. But Rodriguez wouldn't accept it. He kept searching, kept digging, kept calling Jake's name into the rubble. He said desperately. The rest of the team worked alongside him. Mitchell, the corpseman, was using his bare hands to move chunks of concrete. Davis operated a portable ground-penetrating radar unit, scanning for any signs of life. Thompson coordinated with engineers from the Army Corps who'd arrived with heavy equipment. But 6 hours and they'd found nothing. No body, no gear, and no sign that Jake Morrison had ever been there. Corpseman Mitchell finally approached Rodriguez. His voice was quiet, respectful. He whispered softly. He said it had been 6 hours. The amount of rubble, the weight, the force of the collapse. Rodriguez cut him off, he said angrily. He didn't care about the physics. He didn't care about the odds. They don't leave men behind. That's not what SEALs do. That's not what brothers do, he shouted intensely. Mitchell tried again, putting a hand on Rodriguez's shoulder. He said he knew, he understood, but they had to face reality, he said gently. The building had been completely destroyed. 3 floors had collapsed into a pile of rubble 20 feet high. Even if Jake had survived the initial collapse, he would have run out of air by now. Rodriguez jerked away from Mitchell's hand. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not ever. He cried out emotionally. They searched through the night. Floodlights were brought in, turning the rubble pile into a surreal landscape of shadows and dust. Engineers arrived with sophisticated equipment, ground-penetrating radar that could detect objects, bodies, voids in the rubble. Search dogs were brought in, German shepherds trained to find survivors in collapsed buildings. But nothing. The dogs couldn't pick up a scent. The radar showed only solid concrete and rebar. No voids, no pockets, and no spaces where a human could survive, he said sadly. By dawn the commander arrived. He was a good man, a former SEAL himself, and he understood what Rodriguez was feeling. But he also had a responsibility to the rest of the team, he thought seriously. The area wasn't secure. Taliban fighters could return at any moment. They'd been on site for 18 hours now. It was time to make the call. The commander pulled Rodriguez aside, away from the rest of the team. He spoke quietly. With respect for what Rodriguez was going through, he said compassionately. He said he was sorry, truly sorry, but Chief Morrison was gone. They needed to pull back. The area wasn't safe. They couldn't risk more lives. Rodriguez stared at the rubble pile. Somewhere under thousands of pounds of concrete was his swim buddy, Jake Morrison, the guy who'd had his back through 3 deployments. The guy who'd pulled him out of a firefight in Kandahar when Rodriguez took a round to the leg. The guy who'd been the best man at his wedding 2 years ago. The guy who made everyone laugh even when training was hell, he remembered fondly. The guy who never quit, never gave up, never left anyone behind. And now Rodriguez was being ordered to leave him. He whispered that Jake wasn't gone. He couldn't be gone, he cried sadly. But orders were orders. The team packed up. The floodlights were turned off. The equipment was loaded into vehicles. The engineers left. The search dogs were loaded back into their kennels. And the helicopters came in for extraction. Rodriguez was the last one to board. He stood at the edge of the rubble pile, staring down, memorizing every detail. He said emotionally. The twisted rebar. The shattered concrete. The dust still hanging in the air. He made a silent promise to Jake. He'd come back. Somehow, someway he'd come back and bring him home. The helicopter lifted off. Rodriguez watched through the window as the rubble pile grew smaller. And 20 feet below, in a pocket of space no bigger than a coffin, Jake Morrison heard the helicopters fade into the distance. He was completely alone now. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He thought desperately. They'd stopped searching. They'd given up. They thought he was dead. And why wouldn't they? He was buried under tons of concrete, 20 feet down, with no way to signal, no way to communicate, no way to let them know he was alive. Jake had stopped screaming hours ago. He'd learned quickly that screaming did nothing except waste oxygen and energy, both of which he needed to conserve. He thought carefully. He'd done the math in his head, calculated the volume of the space he was trapped in. Maybe 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2 feet high at the tallest point. Like being inside a concrete coffin. The air was thick, dusty, hard to breathe. He figured he had maybe 24 hours of oxygen left. Maybe less. Every breath he took depleted the air in his tiny prison. He could move his right arm. That was something, he thought hopefully. His left arm was completely pinned beneath what felt like a steel beam. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. His legs were trapped from the knees down, immobilized by concrete and rebar. But he could wiggle his toes. He'd checked that first thing. No spinal damage. That was good. If he could somehow get free, he'd be able to move, he said optimistically. If he could get free. That was a big if. The pain was incredible. Every breath felt like knives in his chest. His ribs were definitely cracked, maybe broken. His left shoulder was either dislocated or broken. He couldn't tell which. His head throbbed with what was definitely a concussion, he thought painfully. He'd hit his head on something during the collapse. He remembered that much. There was blood matted in his hair, dried now. His right hand was the only thing that worked properly, and even that was bruised and swollen. But he was alive. He kept reminding himself of that. He whispered hopefully. He was alive. He was breathing. His heart was beating. And as long as those two things were true, he had a chance. SEALs are trained to survive in impossible situations, he said confidently. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. SEAL training. He'd been through it. He'd been through Hell Week, where they'd pushed his body and mind to the absolute breaking point. He'd been through situations in combat where death seemed certain, and he'd survived all of it. He could survive this too. He shouted to himself intensely. Jake felt along the concrete above him with his free hand. It was solid, thick, reinforced, he discovered worriedly. He pushed against it with all his strength. It didn't budge, not even a millimeter. He tried pushing with his legs, but they were pinned too tightly. He couldn't generate enough leverage. He felt around the edges of his prison, searching for any weakness, any crack, any gap. Nothing. The concrete had fallen in such a way that it created a sealed pocket. A tomb. He tried not to think about that word. Tomb. That's what this was. A tomb, he thought fearfully. And unless he found a way out, it would be his final resting place. He checked his gear methodically, cataloging what he had to work with. He thought carefully. His rifle was gone, torn away during the collapse, but his sidearm was still holstered on his hip. Sig Sauer P226, 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. A lot of good that would do against concrete, he thought sarcastically. He had his tactical knife strapped to his calf. He could feel it. That might be useful. His radio was crushed. He could feel the broken pieces digging into his back. His medical kit was pinned somewhere under his body. He could feel the bulk of it, but couldn't reach it. His Camelback water reservoir was leaking. He could feel water dripping onto his face, running down his cheek. The bladder must have been punctured during the collapse. He tried to position his mouth under the leak, catching drops on his tongue. He said desperately. The water tasted like concrete, dust, and blood, but it was water. He didn't know how much was left in the reservoir. Maybe a liter, maybe less. At the rate it was leaking, it would all be gone in a few hours. He needed to ration it, 1 drop at a time. Make it last as long as possible, he whispered carefully. Then he started digging. He couldn't dig down. His legs were pinned. He couldn't dig to the sides. The space was too narrow. So he dug up, he said determinedly. He used his free hand to scrape at the concrete above him. His fingernails caught on the rough surface, tearing. He ignored the pain. He scraped and clawed and dug, moving dust and small fragments of concrete. It was slow work, agonizingly slow. After an hour, he'd managed to create a small indentation in the concrete, maybe half an inch deep. At this rate, it would take him days to dig through 20 feet of rubble, he calculated hopelessly. Days he didn't have. But what else could he do? Give up? Lie here and wait to die? That wasn't in his nature. He shouted angrily. SEALs don't quit. It's drilled into them from day 1 of training. The only easy day was yesterday. Never ring the bell. Never give up. Never surrender, he said intensely. So Jake kept digging, kept scraping, kept fighting. Even though every rational part of his brain told him it was hopeless, he kept fighting. Virginia Beach, Virginia. 3 in the morning. Sarah Morrison's phone rang, shattering the silence of the bedroom. She woke instantly, heart already racing. Every military spouse knows that sound. The phone ringing in the middle of the night. She thought fearfully. Nothing good ever comes from a phone call at 3 in the morning. She grabbed it with shaking hands, saw the number on the screen. Naval Special Warfare Command. Her blood turned to ICE. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, carefully trained for these calls. He spoke formally. It identified itself as Lieutenant Commander Harris, Naval Special Warfare Command. Then came the words that destroyed her world. He was sorry to inform her that her husband, Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, was killed in action during operations in Ramadi, Iraq. An improvised explosive device collapsed a building during a direct action raid. The recovery team searched for 18 hours but was unable to locate his body. He was presumed dead, he said solemnly. Casualty assistance would be contacting her within the hour to discuss arrangements. Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was hearing. She thought in shock. This had to be a mistake. Jake was fine. He'd sent her an email just 2 days ago. He was fine. He was coming home in 3 weeks. They had plans. Emma's birthday party. Their anniversary. He was fine, she thought desperately. The voice on the phone kept talking, saying something about counseling services, about support groups, about honors and benefits. Sarah dropped the phone. In the next room, their daughter Emma was sleeping. 8 years old. 3rd grade. Loved butterflies and soccer and her daddy, she remembered lovingly. She'd drawn a picture for him earlier that day, a stick figure in camouflage with a gun and a big smile. At the top, in careful crayon letters, she'd written, "World's Best Daddy." She'd asked Sarah when they could mail it to him. Soon, Sarah had said. Soon, she remembered sadly. Now that picture would never be mailed. Now Emma would wake up in a few hours, and Sarah would have to tell her that Daddy wasn't coming home. Ever. Sarah stood in the bedroom, frozen, unable to breathe. The room started spinning. She felt faintly. She gripped the edge of the dresser to steady herself. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Jake was the strongest person she knew. He was a Navy SEAL. He'd survived 4 deployments. He'd been in firefights, explosions, ambushes. He always came home. Always, she thought desperately. He'd promised. Before every deployment, he'd hold her and promise he'd come back. And he always had. Always. But not this time. The scream that came out of her wasn't human. It was primal, broken, the sound of a heart shattering. She cried out in anguish. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, confused. She asked what was wrong. Why was Mommy crying? She said innocently. Sarah couldn't answer, couldn't form words. She just pulled Emma into her arms and held her tight, and sobbed. While Sarah Morrison's world was ending in Virginia Beach, Jake Morrison was fighting for his life 20 feet underground in Ramadi. Hour 12 had passed. The water from his camelback had stopped dripping. The reservoir was empty. His throat felt like sandpaper. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He felt painfully. He'd been digging with his free hand for hours, and he'd made almost no progress. The concrete above him was reinforced with rebar. Every time he scraped away enough dust and small fragments to expose the steel, he hit an impenetrable barrier. But he kept digging. What else could he do? He thought desperately. His fingers were raw now, nails broken down to the quick, knuckles scraped and bleeding. Every movement sent pain shooting through his hand. But he kept going. He had to, because the alternative was giving up, and that wasn't an option. He thought about Sarah, about Emma, about the promise he'd made. He remembered lovingly. He'd come home. He always came home. He couldn't break that promise. Not now. Not ever. Then he heard it. A faint scratching sound in the darkness. Jake froze. His hand instinctively went to his knife. He reacted cautiously. The scratching got louder. Closer. Then he felt it. Fur brushing against his arm. A rat. Of course, he thought with disgust. These old compounds were full of rodents. The building collapse had trapped more than just Jake. This rat was probably looking for a way out too, just like he was, he realized. Jake's first instinct was revulsion. He tried to shake the rat off his arm, but it just moved to his chest, its tiny claws scratching through his torn uniform. Then another one appeared, and another. They were everywhere in the darkness, he realized. He discovered fearfully. Dozens of them, maybe more, all trapped in the rubble, all desperately searching for food and water and a way out. Jake felt his stomach turn. The idea of being trapped in this concrete coffin with rats was almost worse than being trapped alone, he thought disgustedly. But then his stomach growled. Loud. Painful. He hadn't eaten in 18 hours. The last meal had been an MRE 12 hours before the raid, and he'd burned thousands of calories during the mission. His body was running on empty, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was going to be down here for a long time, he thought grimly. Days, maybe. He couldn't survive days without food. He needed calories. He needed protein. He needed energy. The rat scurried across his chest again. Jake's hand shot out and grabbed it. He felt it squirm in his grip, felt its tiny heart racing with fear. His own stomach churned at what he was considering. He felt nauseous. He couldn't possibly. The idea was horrifying. Disgusting, inhuman, but so was dying down here. So was breaking his promise to Sarah and Emma. So was giving up, he thought conflictedly. Jake closed his eyes. Tried not to think about it. Just survival. Just calories. Just protein. That's all this was, he told himself. He'd eaten insects during SEER training. He'd eaten things most people wouldn't touch. This was just survival, he reasoned. He whispered an apology to the rat. He said softly. He didn't even know if it could hear him, didn't know why he felt the need to apologize to a rodent. Then, before he could change his mind, he brought it to his mouth and bit down. The taste was indescribable, horrible. He forced himself to chew, to swallow. He struggled intensely. His body wanted to reject it, wanted to vomit. But he kept it down. He had to. This was survival now. This was what it took to live. And Jake Morrison was determined to live. He was determined to keep his promise. He was determined to make it home. He shouted to himself intensely. Sarah Morrison sat in the Navy Casualty Assistance Office at 0900 hours, 12 hours after the phone call that destroyed her life. She was numb. Completely numb, she felt distantly. The officer sitting across from her was talking about arrangements. About the funeral. About honors and ceremonies and protocols. He spoke formally. The words washed over her like water, meaningless and distant. They could do the service at the amphitheater on Naval Station Norfolk, the officer said. Full military honors. Honor guard. Flag presentation. A flyover. The SEAL teams would be there. They want to honor their brother, he explained professionally. Sarah wanted to tell him to stop, to shut up, to leave her alone. She thought angrily, but she couldn't form the words. She just sat there, staring at nothing. The officer kept talking, he continued. They'd need to select a casket, make arrangements for family travel, decide on whether they wanted a viewing, though he gently reminded her that there was no body. Chief Morrison was still listed as missing, though presumed dead. The recovery team had been unable to locate remains due to the extensive damage to the structure and the security situation in Ramadi, he said carefully. No body. That meant no closure. That meant she'd never see him again. Never be able to say goodbye. Never be able to bury him. She thought desperately. He'd just be gone. Vanished. Like he'd never existed. Except for the folded flag they'd give her and the empty casket they'd bury. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. She cried internally. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. She wanted to scream at the officer, to tell him he was wrong, that Jake was alive, that he was coming home. But the words wouldn't come. Emma sat next to her, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She was being so brave. Too brave for an 8-year-old, she observed sadly. She hadn't cried since Sarah told her about Daddy. She'd just gotten very quiet, very still. She'd asked questions. Where was Daddy now? Was he in heaven? Could they visit him? Could she write him letters? She asked innocently. Sarah had tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. How do you explain death to a child? How do you explain that Daddy isn't coming home, ever? How do you shatter a child's world and then expect them to understand? She wondered painfully. The officer was still talking about the funeral. They could schedule it for 4 days out. That would give Jake's team time to return from Iraq. Time for extended family to make travel arrangements. Time for the Navy to coordinate all the details, he explained. Jake Morrison would be laid to rest with full military honors. A hero, a warrior, a man who gave his life for his country. He said respectfully. There would be speeches. There would be tears. There would be a 21-gun salute and a bugler playing taps and a flag folded precisely into a triangle and presented to his widow. All the ceremony and protocol that the military does so well for its fallen. Sarah wanted none of it. She wanted Jake. She wanted her husband. She wanted Emma's father. She cried internally. She wanted the man who made her laugh, who held her when she cried, who promised he'd always come home. But she'd never have him again. Never hear his voice. Never feel his arms around her. Never see his smile. Never watch him play with Emma. Never grow old with him. All of that was gone. Stolen by an explosion in a place she'd never been. For a war she didn't understand, for reasons that meant nothing compared to her loss, she thought bitterly. The officer handed her papers to sign. Consent forms, release forms, acknowledgement that she understood her benefits and entitlements as a widow. Widow. Sarah stared at that word on the form. Widow. At 32 years old, she was a widow. Emma was fatherless. And Jake was gone, she realized painfully. She signed the papers with a shaking hand. The officer expressed his condolences again. He told her that casualty assistance would be in touch daily, that she should call if she needed anything, that the Navy takes care of its own, he said gently. Sarah nodded numbly. Then she took Emma's hand and walked out of the office into the bright Virginia morning, a widow at 32, alone in a world that no longer made sense, she thought hopelessly. Hour 24 underground. Jake Morrison had lost all sense of time. The darkness was absolute. No light penetrated his concrete tomb. He felt blindly. He had no watch. It had been smashed during the collapse. No phone. It was in his cargo pocket, crushed and useless. No way to mark the passage of time except by counting his breaths, counting his heartbeats. But even those had become irregular as panic occasionally gripped him, as the walls seemed to close in, as the weight of 20 feet of concrete pressed down on his chest. He felt suffocatingly. He'd stopped digging temporarily. His fingers were destroyed. Several nails were completely torn off. The others were cracked and bleeding. His knuckles were scraped raw. He felt painfully. Every time he moved his hand, pain shot up his arm. He needed to let them rest, let some of the bleeding stop. But resting meant not making progress. Not making progress meant accepting that he was going to die down here. He thought fearfully. So after what felt like an hour, could have been 20 minutes, could have been 3 hours, he started digging again. The concrete above him was unyielding, reinforced, layer after layer of rebar creating an impossible barrier. But Jake had found something. A tiny gap, maybe 6 inches wide, he discovered hopefully, where 2 pieces of concrete had fallen at an angle, not quite meeting, leaving a narrow space. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was more than he'd had before. He worked his knife into the gap, trying to pry, trying to widen it. The concrete cracked, just a little, a hairline fracture, but it was progress. He thought excitedly. Jake wedged his fingers into the gap, ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood, ignoring everything except the need to make this gap bigger. He focused intensely. He pulled, strained, felt something shift, just a fraction of an inch. But movement. Then pain exploded through his hand. White hot, blinding. His hand was caught between the concrete and rebar, crushed in the narrowing gap. He screamed. He cried out in agony. The sound echoed in his tiny prison. He wanted to pull back, wanted to free his trapped hand. But he didn't. Instead, he pushed forward, pushed harder, felt skin tear, felt bones grinding, felt warm blood slicking the concrete. He felt horrifically, but felt the gap widen. 1 inch, 2 inches. The pain was indescribable. His vision went white. His body wanted to pass out. But he held on to consciousness through sheer will. He struggled intensely. Through the training that had been beaten into him in Hell Week. Through the knowledge that pain was temporary, but quitting was forever. Through the promise he'd made to Sarah, to Emma, to himself, he remembered determinedly. Finally, his hand came free. He pulled it back, cradled it against his chest. He moved carefully. In the darkness, he couldn't see the damage, but he could feel it. At least 2 fingers were broken, maybe more. Deep lacerations across the palm, possibly fractured bones in his hand. He assessed painfully. He fumbled with his free hand, tore strips from his already shredded uniform, wrapped the wounded hand as best he could. The makeshift bandage was soaked with blood instantly, but it was better than nothing. And the gap was wider now, maybe 8 inches. Still not wide enough to crawl through, but wider. Progress. He thought hopefully. Jake allowed himself one moment of hope. Just one. Then he kept digging. Because that's what seals do. They keep going. He said, even when every logical part of their brain screams that it's hopeless, they keep going. Because sometimes hope is all you have. The Morrison house in Virginia Beach was filled with people. SEALs from Jake's team had arrived back stateside early that morning. They'd come straight to the house, still in their uniforms, eyes red from crying on the flight home. They arrived emotionally. Rodriguez sat on the couch, staring at a photo on the mantle. It was from Hell Week, 5 years ago. Him and Jake, covered head to toe in mud, soaking wet, exhausted beyond measure, but grinning like idiots. He remembered fondly. That had been the best day and worst week of Rodriguez's life. Hell Week broke most candidates. But not him. Not Jake. They'd gotten through it together, as swim buddies, as brothers, he thought lovingly. Rodriguez couldn't stop staring at that photo. He kept replaying the mission in his head. The breach, the compound, the explosion, the building collapsing, and then the search. He remembered painfully. 18 hours of searching. He dug until his hands bled. He called Jake's name until his voice gave out. He'd refused to leave, refused to give up. But in the end, he'd followed orders. He'd left. He'd abandoned his swim buddy, he thought guiltily. And now Jake was gone. Mitchell sat next to him, put a hand on his shoulder, tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he'd followed orders, that they'd all done everything they could, he said gently. But Rodriguez couldn't hear it. All he could hear was Jake's voice in his head, from Hell Week, from all those years ago. He remembered. We don't leave each other behind. No matter what. We're swim buddies. We're brothers. We don't quit on each other. And Rodriguez had left him. He'd quit on his brother. He cried internally. The doorbell rang again. More visitors. More casseroles that no one would eat. More condolences that meant nothing. They came constantly. Sarah moved through her own house like a ghost. She accepted hugs from people she barely knew. She nodded at words of comfort that didn't comfort. She kept Emma close, kept her daughter within arm's reach at all times, terrified that if she let go, Emma would disappear too. She worried anxiously. Everything felt unreal, like she was watching someone else's life, someone else's tragedy. Not hers, not her husband, not her daughter's father. She thought distantly. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow at 1400 hours. The amphitheater at Naval Station Norfolk. 2,000 seats. They expected it to be full. They prepared. Jake had been loved. By his team. By the SEAL community. By everyone who'd known him. He was the guy who made people laugh. The guy who had everyone's back. He was remembered fondly. The guy who never complained, never took shortcuts, never let his brothers down. Now he'd be remembered, honored, celebrated, and buried in an empty casket. Emma appeared at Sarah's side, tugging on her sleeve. She held up the picture she'd drawn. The stick figure in camouflage. World's best daddy. She asked in a small voice if they could put this in Daddy's casket. She asked innocently. So he'd have it with him. Sarah's heart shattered all over again. She cried internally. She knelt down, pulled Emma into a fierce hug, and whispered yes. Yes, they could do that. Daddy would love that, she said softly. And as she held her daughter, Sarah felt the last of her strength crumble. She couldn't do this. Couldn't bury her husband tomorrow. Couldn't be strong for Emma. Couldn't survive this, she thought desperately. But she had no choice. She had to be strong. Had to keep going. For Emma. Always for Emma. Hour 48 underground. Jake Morrison was still alive. Barely. His body was shutting down. The dehydration, he felt critically. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His tongue was swollen. His urine, when he could still produce any, was dark brown. His kidneys were starting to fail. The headache from his concussion had intensified. His vision, in the brief moments when he had light from his knife's reflective surface, was blurry and doubled. He felt weakly. He was in the late B continuous stages of dehydration, approaching organ failure. But he was still digging, still fighting. He said determinedly. The gap was bigger now, maybe 12 inches. He could fit his head through it. He tried. He attempted carefully. Got his head and one shoulder into the gap before the pain from his broken hand forced him to stop. But he was close. So close. Above him was more rubble, more concrete, more rebar. But also small spaces between the fallen debris. Air pockets. And where there were air pockets, there was hope, he thought optimistically. He'd felt it an hour ago. A breath of fresh air. Not much. Just a whisper. But fresh. Moving. Which meant somewhere above him was an opening to the surface, he realized excitedly. 20 feet away. Maybe more. But there. The knowledge gave him strength. Gave him hope. Gave him reason to keep fighting. He felt energized. He pushed his broken body harder. Wedged his shoulders into the gap. Felt concrete scrape away skin. Felt his broken ribs grind. Felt his dislocated shoulder scream in protest. He felt agonizingly. But he pushed through. And then he was through. Out of the coffin-sized space that had been his prison for 48 hours. Into a larger void. Maybe 10 feet across, he discovered gratefully. He could move. Could stretch. Could breathe slightly easier. He lay there in the darkness, gasping. Every part of his body screaming in agony. But he'd done it. He'd done it. He laughed weakly with relief. He'd escaped the first tomb, the one 20 feet above him. Jake looked up. He couldn't see anything in the absolute darkness. But he could feel, could sense. The rubble above was unstable, he assessed cautiously. Pieces of concrete balanced precariously on rebar and twisted metal. One wrong move, and it could all come down on him. Bury him again. Kill him this time. He thought fearfully. But he had no choice. He had to climb. Had to get to the surface. Had to keep his promise, he said determinedly. He found a piece of rebar jutting from the rubble. Used it like a ladder rung. Pulled himself up. He climbed carefully. His broken hand screamed. His shattered ankle gave way. He fell. Hit the bottom of the void hard. Felt something else break. He cried out in pain. His collarbone maybe. Or another rib. He lay there, gasping, tasting blood. Every breath was fire. Every movement was agony. He wanted to quit. Wanted to lie here and let death take him, he thought weakly. It would be easy. Peaceful. The pain would end. Then he heard Emma's voice in his head. From 3 weeks ago, before he deployed, he remembered lovingly. Promise you'll come home, Daddy. Promise. And he'd promised. He'd held his little girl and promised he'd come back. SEALs keep their promises. He said intensely. Even when it's impossible. Even when every part of their body is broken. Even when death would be easier. They keep their promises. Jake got up, and he started climbing again. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cold. Appropriate weather for a burial, it seemed ominously. Sarah Morrison sat at her kitchen table, staring at her coffee, unable to drink it. She was wearing a black dress she'd bought yesterday. She'd never owned a black dress before, had never needed one. Now she did, she thought sadly. In a few hours, she'd wear it to her husband's funeral. She'd sit in the front row of the amphitheater, Emma beside her, and watch as they honored Jake's memory. Watch as they presented her with a folded flag. Watch as they played taps. Watch as they buried an empty casket. She thought painfully. Rodriguez arrived at 0800 hours. He was wearing his dress whites, medals gleaming on his chest. But his eyes were hollow. Haunted, he looked devastated. He asked Sarah if there was anything she needed. Anything at all, he offered gently. Sarah just shook her head. What she needed, no one could give her. She needed her husband back. She needed Emma's father back. She needed Jake. She cried internally. At Naval Station Norfolk, preparations were underway. The amphitheater was being set up. 2,000 chairs arranged in perfect rows. The stage was being prepared. They worked efficiently. The casket, empty, flag-draped, heartbreaking, was positioned center stage. The honor guard was rehearsing. The bugler was warming up. The flyover was being coordinated with Naval Air Station Oceana. They coordinated carefully. Everything had to be perfect. Jake Morrison deserved perfect. He'd given everything for his country. The least they could do was honor him properly. They thought respectfully. By 1300 hours, people began arriving. SEALs in dress whites. Officers in service dress blues. Civilians in their darkest suits. They came solemnly. They filled the amphitheater quietly, respectfully. Everyone knew Jake. Everyone had a story about him. About his humor, his courage, his loyalty, his love for his family. They remembered fondly. The seats filled quickly. By 1345, the amphitheater was packed. Standing room only in the back. 2,000 people gathered to say goodbye to a warrior. Sarah arrived at 1350, Emma's hand clutched tight in hers. Emma was wearing a black dress too, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked so small, so fragile, so brave. She observed sadly. They were escorted to the front row, reserved for family. Sarah sat, stared at the casket. That empty box that represented everything she'd lost. She thought hopelessly. Admiral Walsh approached the podium at 1400 hours exactly. The ceremony began. While Admiral Walsh was speaking about Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison's service, sacrifice, and heroism, Jake Morrison was 3 inches from the surface. 3 inches from freedom. 3 inches from life. He was so close. He'd been climbing for 20 hours. 20 hours of agony. 20 hours of impossible effort. He had struggled intensely. 20 hours of refusing to quit. His body was destroyed. His hands were mangled. His ankle was shattered. His shoulder was dislocated. His ribs were broken. He was critically injured. He'd lost so much blood that his vision kept going dark. But he'd climbed. And now he could see light. Real light. Daylight filtering through a final layer of rubble. So close. He thought excitedly. Jake pushed with his legs. Nothing. Tried to pull with his arms. His broken hand wouldn't respond. He struggled desperately. He wedged his good shoulder under a piece of concrete. Pushed. Felt it shift. Pushed harder. Felt something give way. And then, suddenly, brilliantly, impossibly, his hand broke through to open air. Jake sobbed. He couldn't help it. He cried with relief. After 72 hours in darkness, in a concrete tomb, he could feel the sun on his hand. He pushed harder, wedged his way through, felt sharp edges tear his uniform, his skin. Didn't care. Kept pushing. He said determinedly. And then he was out. Out of the rubble. Out of his grave. Lying on top of the pile, gasping, as the afternoon sun beat down on him. He'd done it. 72 hours. No food except insects and rats. No water except condensation. He had climbing through unstable rubble with a shattered body. And he'd survived. He was alive. He laughed with joy. Jake lay there for long minutes, just breathing, just feeling the sun, just being grateful to be alive. Then he remembered. The beacon. He fumbled for his emergency beacon with his good hand. Found it. Miraculously intact, he discovered hopefully. Activated it. The signal went out instantly. Somewhere, a satellite picked up the transmission. Somewhere, an alarm started blaring at JSOC headquarters. Somewhere, people started moving very fast, they reacted urgently. Because the emergency beacon transmitting from Ramadi was registered to Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, who was currently being eulogized at his own funeral in Virginia. The helicopter arrived 37 minutes later. Jake had passed out by then, his body finally surrendering to the trauma and exhaustion. The crew chief rappelled down, took one look at Jake, and immediately called for a medevac. He responded urgently. He keyed his radio with shaking hands. "We have Chief Morrison." "Repeat, we have Chief Morrison. He's alive. Jesus Christ, he's alive," he shouted excitedly. The pilot responded with confusion. That was impossible. Morrison was confirmed Kia 72 hours ago. His funeral was happening right now in Virginia, he said in disbelief. The crew chief looked at Jake's destroyed body, at the rubble pile he'd somehow crawled out of, and said into the radio, "I'm looking at him. I'm touching him. He's breathing. He's alive. Get me a medevac now," he demanded urgently. They loaded Jake onto a stretcher as gently as possible, started IVs in both arms, applied pressure bandages to the worst bleeding. They worked frantically. The medic examined Jake's hands and couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The medic whispered, "He dug through concrete with his bare hands. He actually dug," he said in amazement. The helicopter lifted off, banking toward Ballard Air Base. En route, they radioed ahead with the impossible news. Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison was alive. Injured, critical condition, but alive, they reported excitedly. The message went up the chain of command. Within minutes, it reached JSOC. Within 10 minutes, it reached Naval Special Warfare Command. Within 15 minutes, someone was frantically trying to contact Naval Station Norfolk. They rushed urgently. But the message didn't get through in time. Because at that exact moment, at 14:23 hours, the bugler at Jake Morrison's funeral was raising his instrument to his lips, about to play taps, the final goodbye to a fallen warrior. The first notes of taps echoed through the amphitheater. Mournful, final, they sounded sadly. Sarah Morrison felt her heart break all over again as she listened. She cried silently. This was real. This was happening. Jake was gone. Emma was crying silently beside her, tears streaming down her face. She sobbed quietly. Rodriguez was crying 3 rows back, his shoulders shaking. He wept openly. 2,000 people sat in respectful silence as the bugler played. And then the doors at the back of the amphitheater opened. Nobody noticed at first. The doors were heavy, and they opened slowly, quietly. But then someone in the back row turned, saw the figure standing in the doorway, and gasped. The sound was audible even over the bugler's notes. More people turned. More gasps. A ripple of shock moving through the crowd like electricity. They reacted in disbelief. The bugler's notes faltered, stopped. Silence fell over the amphitheater. 2,000 people turned to look at the man standing in the doorway. They stared in shock. He was barely recognizable. His uniform was shredded and caked with dried blood. His face was covered in concrete dust and grime. His left hand was wrapped in bloody bandages. He leaned heavily on military-issue crutches, his left leg in a temporary splint. He looked destroyed. He looked like he'd crawled out of hell itself. Because he had. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of his own funeral, looking at 2,000 shocked faces, at the flag-draped casket on the stage, at his wife and daughter in the front row. He observed everything. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Time seemed to stop. Everything froze. Then Jake took one step forward. The crutch slipped on the polished marble floor. He stumbled, nearly fell. Rodriguez was out of his seat in an instant, sprinting down the aisle. He caught Jake before he hit the ground, held him up, stared at his face like he was seeing a ghost. He reacted in shock. Rodriguez's voice cracked when he spoke. "Brother, Jake, how?" But he couldn't finish, he said emotionally. Couldn't form words. Just held on to Jake like if he let go, Jake would disappear. But Jake wasn't looking at Rodriguez. He was looking past him, at the front row, at Sarah, at Emma. His family, he focused intensely. The reason he'd dug through 20 feet of concrete. The reason he'd refused to die in that tomb. The reason he'd kept his promise. He thought determinedly. Sarah stood slowly, like she was in a dream. Like she wasn't sure what she was seeing was real. She moved uncertainly. She whispered his name. "Jake," she said softly. Her voice was so quiet, But in the absolute silence of the amphitheater, everyone heard it. Jake tried to move toward her, but his shattered ankle gave out. Rodriguez held him up, supporting his weight. He assisted carefully. Jake looked at his wife, at the woman he loved more than anything in the world, and said the only words that mattered. "I'm not dead yet," he announced triumphantly. And Sarah ran. She didn't walk, didn't hesitate. She ran. She moved desperately, her black heels clicking on the marble floor, her black dress flowing behind her. She ran to her husband, to the man she'd mourned for 3 days, to the man she thought she'd lost forever. She rushed frantically. She hit him with such force that she nearly knocked both Jake and Rodriguez over. She was sobbing, screaming, hitting his chest with her fists. "You died. They told me you died. I planned your funeral. You died," she cried out hysterically. Jake wrapped his good arm around her, held her as tight as his broken body would allow. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His voice was raw, damaged from days without water, from screaming in the darkness. He spoke hoarsely. "I tried to get home. I tried so hard," he whispered emotionally. Sarah was sobbing too hard to speak. She cried uncontrollably. She just held him, felt his heartbeat, felt his warmth, felt him solid and real and alive in her arms. Then Emma was there. She'd jumped up from her seat and run after her mother. She crashed into Jake's legs, wrapped her arms around them, buried her face against him. She hugged desperately. "Daddy, Daddy, you came back. You promised, and you came back," she shouted joyfully. Jake's legs buckled. The pain from his shattered ankle was blinding. But he didn't care. He sank down to his knees on the marble floor, pulling both Sarah and Emma into his arms. He embraced them tightly. The amphitheater erupted. 2,000 people on their feet. Some crying, some cheering, some standing in stunned silence. They reacted explosively. SEALs were rushing forward. Admiral Walsh was standing at the podium, tears streaming down his face, trying to understand what was happening. He cried openly. Command staff were frantically making phone calls, trying to get information. The only thing that mattered was the Morrison family, reunited on the floor of the amphitheater, holding each other, crying. Alive, they embraced lovingly. Rodriguez knelt beside them, put his hand on Jake's shoulder. His voice was thick with emotion. "I should have stayed. I should have kept searching. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left you," he cried guiltily. Jake looked at his swim buddy, his brother, and shook his head. "You followed orders. You did everything right. I don't blame you." "Not for 1 second," he said firmly. Rodriguez broke then. He sobbed emotionally. All the guilt he'd been carrying for 3 days came pouring out. He pulled Jake into a hug, careful of his injuries, and sobbed. Mitchell was there too, and Thompson, and Davis. The entire team surrounding Jake, touching him, making sure he was real. They verified desperately, making sure their brother was actually alive. They'd mourned him. They'd carried his casket. They'd blamed themselves. And now here he was, broken but alive, battered but home. They realized joyfully. Emma pulled back from the group hug, looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Daddy, you look like a zombie," she said innocently. The comment was so unexpected, so perfectly Emma, that everyone laughed. They chuckled with relief. Even Jake, though it hurt his broken ribs. "I feel like a zombie, kiddo," he laughed happily. Emma's face got serious. "Did you fight bad guys?" she asked curiously. Jake thought about the 72 hours underground. The rats, the darkness, the pain, the impossible climb. He remembered intensely. "Yeah, baby. I fought really bad guys. But I won," he said proudly. Emma nodded, satisfied. "I knew you would. You always win," she said confidently. Sarah pulled back slightly, looked at Jake's destroyed body. The bloody bandages, the splinted leg, the way he couldn't put weight on his ankle, the way his left shoulder hung at a wrong angle. She observed worriedly. "Jake, you're hurt. You need a hospital. You need—" Jake cut her off with a kiss. It was brief, gentle, but it said everything he couldn't put into words. He kissed lovingly. When he pulled back, he smiled. "I'm okay. I'm home. That's all that matters," he said gratefully. Admiral Walsh approached, still trying to process what was happening. "Chief Morrison, we received word of your rescue about 20 minutes ago. The helicopter is still en route to Ballot. How are you here?" he asked confusedly. Jake looked confused. "Helicopter, sir? I was extracted 6 hours ago. They flew me to Ballad, stabilized me, then put me on AC-17 to Ramstein. From Ramstein, they flew me to Andrews. I got here 30 minutes ago, he explained. The Admiral was doing the math. That timeline was impossible. Except Jake was sitting right here, alive, present at his own funeral. He realized in amazement. Chief, you've been declared dead for 72 hours. How did you survive? He asked seriously. Jake's face darkened. The memories clearly painful, he remembered grimly. I dug, sir. The building collapsed on top of me, buried me 20 feet down. My team searched, but couldn't find me. So I dug, with my hands, through concrete. For 3 days, he said intensely. The amphitheater had gone quiet again. Everyone was listening. Everyone needed to hear this story. They focused intently. How one of their brothers had survived the impossible. Jake continued, his voice getting quieter. I was trapped in a space about the size of a coffin. Had maybe a day's worth of air. No food. My water ran out after 12 hours, he explained carefully. I thought I was going to die down there. Thought I'd never see Sarah again. Never see Emma again, he said sadly. Emma squeezed his hand. Jake looked down at his daughter, found strength in her presence. He smiled warmly. But then I remembered my promise. I promised you I'd come home. So I dug. I found a gap in the concrete. Spent hours making it bigger. Tore my hands apart doing it. But I got through, he continued determinedly. Then I climbed. 20 feet up through unstable rubble. Fell twice. Broke more bones. But I kept climbing. Because SEALs don't quit. And because I made a promise, he said proudly. Rodriguez asked the question everyone was thinking. What did you eat? How did you survive 3 days without food or water? He asked carefully. Jake's face twisted. This was clearly hard for him to say. He struggled emotionally. I ate what I could find. Insects. And rats. The building was full of them. And I drank condensation. Water that dripped from my camelback before it ran out. It wasn't much. But it was enough to keep me alive, he said grimly. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone trying to imagine the horror of being trapped underground, alone, eating rats to survive. They contemplated horrifically. Sarah was crying again, but quietly now. Crying for what her husband had endured. For the nightmare he'd lived through. She cried sadly. For the strength it must have taken to keep going. Jake wrapped his arm around her, pulled her close. I'm okay. I'm here. That's what matters, he said reassuringly. Admiral Walsh cleared his throat. Chief Morrison, you need immediate medical attention. We're going to transport you to Walter Reed. Full examination. Treatment for your injuries, he ordered firmly. Jake nodded, but didn't move. Didn't let go of Sarah and Emma. He held tightly. The Admiral understood. We'll give you a few minutes. Take your time, he said gently. He turned to address the stunned crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison is very much alive. This funeral is canceled. We'll reconvene at a later date to properly honor Chief Morrison's incredible survival and sacrifice, he announced formally. The crowd began to disperse slowly, everyone still in shock. But the SEALs stayed. Jake's team surrounded him, unwilling to let him out of their sight. They stayed protectively. Rodriguez helped Jake to his feet, supported his weight. Come on, brother. Let's get you to the hospital, he said caringly. Jake nodded, but turned to Emma first. Hey kiddo, you still have that picture you drew? The one with the soldier? He asked softly. Emma pulled it from her pocket. She'd been carrying it to put in the casket. Jake took it with his good hand, looked at it. World's best daddy written in crayon, he read lovingly. Can I keep this? It got me through some pretty dark times down there. Thinking about you. About this picture, he said emotionally. Emma nodded vigorously. You can keep it forever, Daddy, she said excitedly. Jake carefully folded it and put it in his torn uniform pocket. Forever sounds good, he said warmly. The trip to Walter Reed was surreal. Jake in an ambulance, Sarah and Emma beside him. Rodriguez riding up front with the driver, refusing to leave his swim buddy. They traveled together. The news was already spreading. Social media was exploding. Navy SEAL attends his own funeral. Man buried alive for 72 hours survives. Hero digs through concrete to keep promise to daughter, the headlines read. The story was everywhere. But Jake didn't know about any of that. He was focused on Sarah's hand in his, on Emma curled up against his side, On the fact that he was alive and home, he felt grateful. At Walter Reed, the doctors swarmed him. 13 broken bones, severe dehydration, acute kidney injury, multiple lacerations, dislocated shoulder, shattered ankle, broken ribs, broken fingers, concussion, infection in both hands from the rat bites and the digging, malnutrition. They listed extensively. The list went on and on. The attending physician pulled Sarah aside. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband should be dead. The injuries alone should have killed him. The dehydration definitely should have. The fact that he's alive, that he's conscious, that he dug himself out and climbed 20 feet. It's medically impossible," he said in amazement. Sarah looked through the window at Jake, at her husband being examined by a team of doctors. "He made a promise," she said simply. "He promised he'd come home." "Jake keeps his promises," she explained proudly. The doctor nodded slowly. "That kind of will to live, that determination, that's what saved him. Not his training, not luck. Pure determination. Your husband is remarkable, Mrs. Morrison," he said respectfully. Jake stayed at Walter Reed for 2 weeks. Multiple surgeries on his hands to repair the damage. Surgery on his ankle to set the bones properly. His shoulder was relocated and stabilized. His ribs were wrapped. They treated comprehensively. He was given massive amounts of 4 fluids to rehydrate and flush his kidneys. Antibiotics for the infections. Pain medication for everything else. The doctors said he'd recover, but his hands would never be the same. The damage was too extensive, they explained carefully. He might regain 70% function, maybe 80 if he was lucky, but 100%? Never. That meant Jake's career as an operator was over. SEALs need their hands. For shooting, for climbing, for everything, he realized. You can't operate with hands that only work 80%. The news should have devastated him, should have crushed him. Being a SEAL was his identity, his life, everything he'd worked for, he thought. But when the doctors told him, Jake just nodded. "Okay, then I'll do something else," he said calmly. Sarah, sitting beside his bed, asked if he was okay with that. "Really okay?" she asked worriedly. Jake looked at her, at Emma, who was coloring in a chair in the corner. At the hospital room that meant he was alive, he observed gratefully. "Sarah, I spent 3 days buried alive. I ate rats. I dug through concrete until my fingers broke. I did all of that to get back here, to be with you and Emma. If the price for that is I can't be an operator anymore, that's a price I'll pay gladly. I'm alive. I'm home. That's all I ever wanted," he said contentedly. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in front of a room full of BUD/S candidates. First day of Hell Week orientation. He walked with a slight limp now. His left ankle would never fully heal. His left hand was scarred, the fingers slightly crooked from the breaks that hadn't set quite right. He moved carefully. But he was here, teaching, passing on what he'd learned, showing the next generation of SEALs what it means to never quit, he taught proudly. The candidates sat at attention, watching this instructor with the scarred hands and the limp. They'd all heard the story. The SEAL who was buried alive and dug himself out, who survived 72 hours underground, who attended his own funeral. They knew the legend. And now he was standing before them, about to teach them about Hell Week. Jake's voice was strong, confident. "You're about to go through the hardest week of your lives. 168 hours of cold, wet, miserable suffering," he announced seriously. "You're going to be pushed beyond what you think is possible. Most of you will quit, and that's okay. Not everyone is meant to be a SEAL. But before you make that decision, before you ring that bell and walk away, I want to tell you a story," he said intensely. He paused, looked at each candidate. "Last year, I was on a direct action raid in Ramadi. The building exploded, collapsed on top of me, buried me 20 feet underground in a space about the size of a coffin. My team searched for me for 18 hours. They couldn't find me. They declared me Kia. They left, and I was alone, completely alone, in total darkness, with no food, no water, and no way out," he explained dramatically. The room was silent. Every candidate hanging on his words. They listened intently. "I spent the next 72 hours digging my way out. With my hands." He held up his scarred hands. "These hands. I dug through reinforced concrete, broke most of my fingers, tore off my fingernails. I ate insects and rats because I was starving. I drank condensation because I was dying of thirst. And then I climbed. 20 feet up through unstable rubble. Fell twice. Broke more bones. But I kept climbing, he said powerfully. Jake stepped closer to the candidates. You want to know what got me through it? It wasn't my training. It wasn't my strength. It was one simple fact. I refused to die in that hole. I made a promise to my daughter that I'd come home. And I was going to keep that promise no matter what it took, he said passionately. That's what being a SEAL means. It means when everyone else quits, when everyone else says it's impossible, when every logical part of your brain says to give up, you keep going. Because you made a promise. To your team. To your family. To yourself, he declared intensely. He pointed at the brass bell outside. The bell that ends Hell Week for those who quit. Hell Week is going to push you to your breaking point. You're going to want to ring that bell. You're going to have every reason to quit. Cold. Exhaustion. Pain. Fear, he listed seriously. But before you ring it, I want you to ask yourself one question. Am I quitting because I truly cannot continue? Or am I quitting because it's hard? He asked pointedly. Jake's voice got quieter, more intense. Because here's the truth. Being a SEAL is hard. Every single day is hard. The training is hard. The missions are hard. Being away from your family is hard, he explained seriously. But we don't quit when it's hard. We quit when it's impossible. And even then, he smiled. Even then, we find a way. I dug through 20 feet of concrete to prove that. So when you're in Hell Week, when you're cold and wet and exhausted and everything in you wants to quit, remember, nothing is impossible. You just have to want it bad enough, he said inspiringly. The candidates were silent for a long moment after Jake finished. Then one raised his hand. Chief Morrison, if you could go back, would you do anything differently? Would you have not gone on that mission? He asked curiously. Jake didn't hesitate. No, I'd do it exactly the same. Because that mission, that sacrifice, it made me who I am. It taught me what I'm capable of. It taught me the value of every single day I get with my family, he explained thoughtfully. Would I want to go through it again? Hell no. But would I change it? No. Because it taught me that the only limits we have are the ones we put on ourselves, he said wisely. 2 years later, the Morrison family sat in their backyard in Virginia Beach. It was Emma's 10th birthday. The yard was full of kids, balloons, cake. Normal suburban birthday party chaos. They celebrated joyfully. Jake sat at the picnic table, watching Emma play with her friends. Sarah sat beside him, her hand in his scarred one. He squeezed gently. She squeezed back. They connected lovingly. No words needed. This was what he'd dug for. This was what he'd climbed for. This was what he'd survived for. He thought gratefully. Emma ran over, breathless from playing. Daddy, will you play tag with us? She asked excitedly. Jake looked at his ankle, at his limp. Playing tag wasn't really in the cards anymore. But he stood up anyway. Absolutely, he said enthusiastically. He chased Emma around the yard, moving slower than the kids, his limp obvious. But he was playing. He was there. He was present. That was what mattered. He thought happily. Later that night, after the party was over and Emma was in bed, Sarah and Jake sat on the back porch. Stars overhead. Cool breeze off the ocean, they relaxed peacefully. Sarah B. continued him the question she'd been wondering for 2 years. Do you ever think about it? About being trapped down there, she asked softly. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Every day, he finally said. Every single day? Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can feel the concrete pressing down on me. I can taste the dust. I can feel the darkness. And I panic, he admitted emotionally. Sarah squeezed his hand. What do you do when that happens? She asked gently. Jake looked at her. At the woman he loved. At the house where his daughter slept safely. At the life he'd fought so hard to get back to, he observed gratefully. I remember why I dug. I remember what I was digging toward. You, Emma. This life. And the panic goes away. Because I made it. I'm here. I'm home. And that makes everything worth it, he said contentedly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Jake spoke again. You know what the hardest part was? It wasn't the pain. It wasn't the hunger or thirst. It wasn't even the darkness, he explained thoughtfully. It was the doubt. The voice in my head telling me to give up. Telling me I was going to die down there. Telling me that digging was pointless. That climbing was impossible. That I should just lie down and let it end, he said intensely. He paused. That voice was so loud, Sarah. So convincing. And some days, I almost listened to it, he confessed sadly. Sarah turned to look at him. What stopped you? She asked curiously. Jake smiled, pulled out his wallet, opened it. Inside was the picture Emma had drawn. World's best daddy. Worn and faded now, but still there, he showed lovingly. This. Every time that voice told me to quit, I thought about this picture. About the promise I made. About you and Emma waiting for me. And I kept digging. One handful at a time. 1 inch at a time. 1 breath at a time, he said determinedly. He put the wallet away. That's what I teach the BUD/S candidates now. It's not about being stronger or tougher than everyone else. It's about having something to fight for. Something that matters more than the pain, more than the exhaustion, more than the fear, he explained wisely. For me, it was you and Emma. For them, it'll be something else. But everyone needs that reason, that purpose, that promise. Because when things get impossible, and they will get impossible, that's what keeps you going, he said seriously. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm glad you kept your promise, she whispered softly. Jake kissed the top of her head. Me too, he said warmly. They sat there for hours, watching the stars, grateful for every moment, every breath, every day they had together. They relaxed peacefully. Because Jake Morrison knew better than most how fragile life is, how quickly it can be taken away, how precious every moment really is. He understood profoundly. He'd been buried alive. He'd died and come back. And now he lived every day like the gift it was. Jake Morrison teaches BUD/S candidates now. He'll never operate again. His hands aren't good enough. His ankle won't let him run like he used to. But he can teach. He can inspire. He can show the next generation of warriors what it means to never quit. He serves proudly. And every Hell Week, he tells his story. About the dark and about the moment he saw his wife and daughter at his own funeral, he shares emotionally. The moment that made every second of suffering worth it. The candidates listen, wide-eyed, trying to comprehend that level of survival. That level of determination they absorb intensely. And then Jake says the words that define him, that define all SEALs. We're all buried sometimes. Life buries us. Stress, failure, loss, fear. And when you're buried, you have 2 choices. You can give up. Let the darkness win. Ring the bell. Or you can dig. 1 handful at a time. 1 inch at a time. 1 breath at a time. He instructs powerfully. You can refuse to quit. You can refuse to break your promise. You can refuse to die in that hole. The question isn't whether you'll get buried. You will. Everyone does. The question is, will you dig? He challenges intensely. And every class, every year, those words echo in the minds of candidates as they enter Hell Week. As they push through the cold and the wet and the exhaustion. As they hear that voice telling them to quit, they remember determinedly. They remember Jake Morrison. They remember the man who dug through 20 feet of concrete, who ate rats to survive, who attended his own funeral, who refused to break his promise. They recall inspiringly. And they dig. They keep going. They become SEALs. Because Jake Morrison showed them that nothing is impossible if you want it badly enough. If you have something worth fighting for. If you refuse to quit. He proved triumphantly. That's his legacy now. Not the missions he ran. Not the enemies he defeated. But the lesson he taught. The example he set. The proof he provided that human will can overcome anything. He demonstrated powerfully. Even death. Even impossibility. Even being buried alive. Jake Morrison he walked into his own funeral. He accomplished impossibly. But more than that, he refused to quit when quitting made sense. He kept his promise to come home. And now he spends every day teaching others to do the same. To find their reason. To make their promise. To dig. He inspires constantly. If this story inspired you, subscribe. He said enthusiastically. Comment below what you would have done in Jake's situation. And remember, we're all buried sometimes. The question is, will you dig? He asked challengingly. Until next time, stay strong, never quit, and keep your promises. Because somewhere, right now, someone is facing their own impossible situation. Someone is buried. Someone is hearing that voice telling them to give up. He reflected seriously. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember Jake Morrison's story. They'll remember that one SEAL who refused to die in a hole, who refused to break his promise, who dug his way home. He succeeded triumphantly. And maybe that will give them the strength to keep digging too, he hoped inspiringly. That's the real lesson. That's what Jake Morrison's 72 Hours Underground taught us. Not that we're invincible, not that we can't be broken, but that even when we are broken, even when we are buried, even when death seems certain, we can still choose to dig. He taught powerfully. We can still choose to fight. We can still choose to keep our promises. And sometimes, that choice is all that stands between us and the darkness, he explained profoundly. Choose to dig. Always choose to dig. He concluded powerfully.